As I said, we're going to be going back to the theme that Paul began with. If you remember going back to chapter 1, he immediately began to defend the fact that he had changed his plans uh, with Corinth. He obviously had let them know that what his intention was to return back to Jerusalem, kind of give a report on the work, and then he was going to come back and start in Corinth on his next missionary journey, and then he didn't do that. And so he began there in chapter 1 explaining why he had changed his mind. In fact, he had their best intention at heart in doing so. And now he's going to come back to this idea of defending himself. But before we look at it and say, well, he's being awfully defensive, and even maybe making the point, people who think defensively all the time are not really being productive. We're going to talk about why he is defending himself and ultimately recognizing that it's really not Paul that he's defending. It is, in fact, God he is defending. And that's why it was so important that he come back to this theme again. We've talked about the idea that the theme of this book is the Father of mercies, the God of all comforts. And you might ask, well, how does Paul defending himself relate to that idea? Well, let's think of it this way. If somebody is going to offer you advice or offer you help or even offer you encouragement, if it's someone that you don't respect, if it's someone that you just don't see any value in what they say, what comfort will that be to you? Not much, is it? The point is that Paul has given a lot of messages of comfort to the Corinthians. But if they don't value that message, if they don't value the person who's delivering the message, then that comfort is really not comforting. And ultimately, of course, the point is that Paul has been giving this comfort as a messenger of God, as an apostle of Jesus Christ. And so if there are those that are attacking his apostleship, ultimately what Paul is going to show us is that they are attacking Jesus Christ himself. They are attacking the God who sent Jesus. And so this defense is not really a defense of Paul. It is a defense of an apostle of Jesus Christ, who happens to be, in this case, Paul. So let's look a little bit at this message. As I said, it really covers the last 4 chapters of the book. And you're going to see repeated things. Paul does this so often. I suppose you've all heard at one point or another, what are the 3 most important lessons in trying to make sure somebody understands something? Well, repetition, repetition, and repetition. Well, that's what Paul is going to do when he is talking about the importance of this message and the importance of understanding what he was sent to do there at Corinth. He is going to repeat himself. And it's for a very important point, that they understand what this really means. So Paul's going to come back to what he had started with, this idea that defending himself as an apostle of Jesus Christ, because he wants them to understand this is an attack against God himself. Specifically, it's an attack against the message of God, a message of mercy and comfort. And what Paul is going to do is take the weapon of his critics out of their hand, or in this case, out of their mouth, and use it against them. In fact, God does this all the time. It really is something that the more I've thought about it, the more I've kind of watchful for it, I see where Jesus did this. I see where God has done this. Let me give you an example. David's been talking about the scheme of redemption going through the Old Testament. And we're not yet to this point, but we're going to get there very closely. When they get to the land of Canaan the first time, and they're ready to go into the land of Canaan, and they send out the spies come back with that bad report. And the people are all distressed and they want to overthrow Moses and Aaron and appoint a new leader. And their argument is, because if we try to invade that land, those giants, our children are going to die. And so God tells the people, said, you all will not enter that land. You all will die in the wilderness. And I'm going to take your children that you thought were going to die, and they are going to be the ones who will go into that land and defeat those giants. God takes that weapon and uses it against them. And you see that over and over and over again in the Bible. We're going to see where Paul is going to do that. He's going to take the arguments of his critics and just rip that out of their mouths and turn around and use it against them, which is, of course, God showing his ultimate power. Let us start by talking about rhetoric. And there have been times where I talked about we're in political season now. Well, I don't think there's ever a time when we're not in political season. Everything is politics with politicians. And with the 24-hour news cycles that we have now, everything is that. And rhetoric is a very big part of that. It may be the biggest part of politics. This was very common in Corinthian culture. And in fact, it was actually part of the competition, if you would, or the conflict that existed between Corinth and Athens. Corinth and Athens were the two most powerful city-states in Greece. They were located actually fairly close together. It wasn't that far to go from Corinth to Athens or back and forth. And so there was a lot of conflict, a lot of rivalry between Corinth and Athens. Corinthian wisdom was based on rhetoric, while Athenian wisdom was based on sophistry. The Corinthian wisdom was essentially that the ability of the speaker, his appearance, the way in which he could project himself as he spoke, the way that he could destroy his rivals and what he would say about them. That is the thing that they valued. That's what they considered to be the greatest orators, were the ones who could destroy their opponents just by what they said. Does that sound a little bit like our politics today? Yep, very much so. The Athenian wisdom was based on sophistry. In fact, the word sophistication, when you talk about someone who uses sophisticated words, that is sophistry. It's the idea of impressing you by what I say, the words that I use, how impressive they sound. That was the two rivalry. The Corinthians were all about, let me impress you by the way I look and by the way I speak. The Athenians were, let me impress you by the wizardry of the words that I use. Of course, neither one of them is God's wisdom. God's wisdom is, what I will say will help you. That's the consistent message that you get from God all through his words. Even as you go back again to the Old Testament and you look at the commands and the precepts of God, every single one of them was designed to benefit the listener. And so when Paul was dealing with the Corinthians and the attack of his critics, very much this idea of rhetoric is at the base of that. That's one of those things that helps us to see more clearly what's going on as we understand the culture. And that was the Corinthian culture. And that was the nature of the attacks against Paul, was saying, well, he's terrible at rhetoric. And Paul's going to say, well, I didn't try to be. He never tried to be good at rhetoric. So let's go back now, look at this. And you can always tell when there's a new section in Paul's writings, partly because of his formula when he says, now, it's introducing a new subject, but also the very tone. How did we end chapter 9? We talked about this at the end of our last class. What was the spirit that you find with Paul? I even talked about how he just kind of set down his quill. What's he thinking? Yeah, he's in absolute awe of what God has done. And what he has talked about, how that this idea of worship is inspired, it's voluntary, it comes about from recognizing what God has done for us. And we just want to fall down and worship God as we understand that. And so he says, thanks be to God for this indescribable gift, this gift of why we would worship him. But then we get into the very next thing that Paul says, and now he's getting defensive. He says, now I, Paul, myself urge you by the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. Why would he emphasize the meekness and the gentleness of Christ? Even today, if someone comes up to you and says, you know what, I've known you for a while now, you're a pretty meek fella or a pretty meek lady. Do you take that as a compliment or do you take that as an insult? Yeah, it depends on who says it and what's the context in which they're saying it. Well, that was what they were saying about Paul. He's pretty meek. We're going to see it as we go through chapter 10, that they will say his presence is unimpressive. He's meek in person. He's bold in his letters. So yeah, it was very much of an insult. So Paul says, I urge you by the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. Okay, now is meekness and gentleness a good thing or a bad thing? If it's associated with Jesus, what is it? It's a good thing, absolutely. Here's what I talked about. Paul took their weapon, calling him meek, ripped it out of their mouth, turned it around and used it against them. He says, I am meek, just like my Lord. He's going to say later, I am just as Christ was. Being meek, being gentle, that's a compliment. Even if people don't intend it to be a compliment, it is a compliment because it is the nature of our Lord. Is meekness the same as weakness? No. Meekness is, as I've often heard it described, strength under control. It is someone who's doing what is the right thing to do, instead of doing something because it's the only option because you're not strong enough to do anything else. And so Paul says, I urge you by this meekness and gentleness. The word that's translated gentleness is only used one other time in the Bible, in Acts chapter 24. Interestingly, it was not spoken by our Lord or one of his disciples. It was actually spoken by a Greek lawyer by the name of Tertullius. And it was used by Tertullius to compliment Felix, I think it was. I can't remember whether it was Felix or Festus, but I think it was Felix. Complimenting Felix for the way that he had administered justice among the Jews. Probably he didn't believe it when he said it, because Felix actually didn't have a reputation of being a very just governor. In fact, just the opposite. The Jews had complained about him a lot. But this lawyer, trying to flatter him, had called him gentle. And the idea there was someone who makes the right decision, something that's good for others. But Paul says, by the meekness and the gentleness of Jesus, I urge you, and notice he says, I who am meek when face to face with you, but bold towards you with bold towards you when absent. What's he doing here? Is he describing himself? Well, sort of. Do you think Paul might be quoting somebody here? I think that's exactly what he's doing. He's quoting his critics. That's what they were claiming about him. He's one person when he's in front of us, and he's somebody different when he's writing a letter, hiding behind the pen and ink, as we might say. We kind of make the same comments today that people will be really ugly on social media where they're hiding behind a keyboard. But then when they meet you face to face, they're going to be somebody entirely different. Well, Paul is again taking their quote, and he's going to show that, number one, the way they use it is wrong. And number two, what the actual words mean. He said, I am. Because those are good words. And he's already said that about Jesus Christ. So he's taking away their weapon from them. Now, he says, I want to be meek among you. He did not want to come there and blow the place up. He didn't want to come there as a firebrand. He didn't want to come there just knocking heads around. Notice what he says here in verse 2. I ask that when I am present, I may not be bold with the confidence which is I propose to be courageous against some. So Paul says, I will be bold if I need to be, but I don't want to be. And I'm asking. Who's he asking? Who holds in their hand the ability to decide how Paul is going to arrive? I'm sorry. Yeah, the Corinthians themselves. That's why he's writing this letter. He says, I'm asking that you make that decision for me. That I can come there in meekness and gentleness. That's the way I want to come. But he says, if I have to, I will come and be bold. And essentially he's telling him, it's your decision. We're going to get back to that a little bit later in the chapter. We'll flesh that out a little bit more. But he's putting that right there for them to decide. You decide how I'm going to come. You decide what my spirit will be. And notice verse 4. Actually, verses 3 and 4. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. Why does he talk about this idea of walking in the flesh? Well, we see it because of the end of verse 2. He says, I propose to be courageous against some who regard us as if we walked according to the flesh. So here's the second criticism of Paul. The first one is he's meek in person and he's bold when he's writing a letter. The second one is, well, he lives according to the flesh. He lives his life by fleshly means. Really quite ironic that they would make that charge against Paul because that has been the focus of so much of his writing, especially the first epistle that he wrote. Remember what he said to him? He said, I still have to write to you as children. Why? Because you are still fleshly and you're not spiritual. So this was one of Paul's basic arguments in that first letter, and yet his critics were making that about him, saying, oh, he's walking according to the flesh. Paul said, I'm going to show you I don't. He said, I'm going to show you that even though I live in the flesh, I don't live according to the flesh. And then he goes on in verse 4, he says, the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but are divinely powerful. Power is a term that's used a lot in 2 Corinthians. And it's always used about God's power. Not Paul's power, not anybody else's, certainly not his critics. It's always God's power. The weapons of our warfare are divinely powerful for the destruction of the fortresses. Implied there is the fortresses of the flesh. So what Paul is saying here is they accuse me of walking according to the flesh, but in fact, the weapons that I wield are for the destruction of those fleshly things, the fortresses of the flesh. And so Paul is making it very clear here. There is a war. There is absolutely a war going on in Corinth. In fact, going on all around the world. It's God's kingdom against those who are of the world. And Paul makes it very clear, this is a war that he is all in. You're going to see some of the strongest language that you can see anywhere in the writings of the Apostle Paul, particularly these next two verses. This is a war that must be fought, and it's a war that will be won. It's very similar, in fact, to the book of Revelation. Book of Revelation talks about that same warfare that existed in those days. Not something, I just saw a guy on TV, maybe last night, that was talking about what's going to be happening in Jerusalem sometime in the near future, and he's laid out Armageddon, all that kind of stuff. This is a war that's gone on from the day of Pentecost. This is a war that has gone on where Satan is trying to defeat the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And it's a war he's lost. But Paul says, I'm all in. Notice what he says. I very rarely will just read verses, but these two verses are just so important. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. We are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. We are ready to punish all disobedience whenever your obedience is complete. Notice how many times he says all, every. This is not a battle to fight just to get the upper hand. It's not a defensive battle where you're just trying to keep from being destroyed. This is a battle to be fought to the end. And he says, we are going to destroy it all. And the reason, he says right away, because it is raised up against the knowledge of God. If people do not know God, what is their eternal destiny? They're lost. They're helpless. They have no answer. Can we idly stand by and say, well, that's too bad? Paul couldn't. That's what he's saying. I am going to fight. Paul is saying, I am going to fight against everything that is raised up against the knowledge of God. Now, how many different ways does Satan try to distract us from the knowledge of God? Well, we don't have some time tonight to cover them all, do we? How many of them do we have to fight against? Paul just told us, every one of them. Fighting against every one of them. And he says, we are going to fight against them. Notice he said, every thought must be taken captive. I mentioned the Corinthian wisdom was rhetoric. Elevate myself, destroy my opponent, I win. You ever watch presidential debates on TV? What's the purpose? Elevate myself, destroy my opponent, I win. And as soon as the debate is over, all the talking heads get on there. What do? They point out the zingers, the one-liners. Here's where this candidate elevated himself and destroyed his opponent, or vice versa. Just depends on which network you're watching. Paul says anything that is standing in the way of the knowledge of God, that's my enemy. And he was all in for that battle. But he's not saying this because he's all in. Why is he saying it to the Corinthians? Exactly. They have to be all in. In fact, that's what he says at the end of verse 6. That one really threw me when I first read that. I had to read that 2 or 3 times to really understand what Paul was saying. Again, go back to verse 6. We are ready to punish all disobedience. That part, pretty self-explanatory. But notice he says, whenever your obedience is complete. If Paul is in this warfare for God, what difference will that make in Corinth if he is in fact in Ephesus or Macedonia where he was writing this letter? Won't make any difference, will it? It's the people there that ultimately have to fight this battle. You see, Paul is making a very clear distinction between his audience, which is the church in Corinth that he established, that he nurtured, that he helped grow, and his critics. We'll talk in a minute about where those critics came from. But the key is they weren't a part of the group that he had established. And so when he's talking about destroying these thoughts, taking captive these thoughts and destroying the speculation, he's talking about the critics. But he's writing to and speaking to the Corinthians. They're the audience. And so he's telling you, the Corinthians, don't listen to them, the critics. We have to understand that distinction. Now, physically, where were they located? They were all located in Corinth. And in fact, we're going to see they were even all part of that same church. But they were definitely 2 different groups of people. And that's what Paul is trying to get them to understand. You have 2 different groups of people here. And one group is in opposition to God. One group is raising up things against the knowledge of God. And you've got to fight that battle. So that's why he says we're taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And we're going to punish disobedience. We're going to punish those critics. But that can only be done when their obedience is complete. What does he mean by their obedience being complete? Do they have to be perfect? Understand everything there is to know about the scriptures? What does he mean by their obedience is complete? Particularly in light of this context that we're talking about. Let's say that again. I'm sorry. Yeah, when they stop living according to the flesh, when they go all in to fight this battle. I kind of think when you go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, remember the situation where the man was living with his father's wife? What was the problem in Corinth? I mean, I know what was wrong with that man. Paul made that very clear. But what was the problem with the church in Corinth? They accepted it. They tolerated it. It didn't mean that they thought it was good, that they endorsed it. The point was they weren't all in. They weren't all in to say, this is wrong and it cannot continue among us. And that's what Paul criticized them for. Talked about the idea of a little leaven. Leaven's the whole lump of dough. Well, he's returning back to that theme. He says, I'm all in on this battle. But he doesn't say I, he says we. And he's including them, and he's saying, you've got to be all in also. And when you're all in on this, then we will defeat those critics. We will defeat those who are trying to raise up an obstacle to the knowledge of God. Again, this is battle. And we need to understand that it is battle. So then we get to verse 7. Paul asks the question, or makes a statement here. He says, you are looking at things as they are outwardly. It's interesting. It's the same sort of thing Jesus faced. Go back, if you would, to John chapter 7. I suspect that most of us have verse 24 memorized, because it's our answer to people who say, oh, judge not that you be not judged. Judge with righteous judgment. I'll take your proof text and I'll use my proof text on top of it. Let's look at the context, though. We go back to John chapter 7 and was in chapter 6. We go back to chapter 7 and let's start about verse 20. The multitude answered Jesus and said, you have a demon. Who seeks to kill you? Jesus answered and said to them, I did one deed and you all marvel. On this account, Moses is giving you circumcision, not because it's from Moses, but from the fathers. And on the Sabbath, you circumcise a man. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, if the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because I made an entire man well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. The criticism of Jesus was the fact that he healed a man on the Sabbath day. He broke the Sabbath. He was working on the Sabbath. And Jesus says that is a judgment of appearance. It's not a judgment of reality. It's not a judgment of understanding what I've really done. And so that's why he said in that context, don't judge according to outward appearance, but instead judge with a righteous, discerning judgment. That's the same point that Paul is making here. He said, you are looking at the outward rhetoric. That's what the critics were saying. Paul gets up there and speaks, and then I tell you, that guy can put you to sleep. He's as boring as he can be. He doesn't use that bold speech that he does in his letters. He doesn't impress anybody. He hasn't put anybody down. He hasn't shown that he's a more powerful speaker than anybody else. Apollos, he's a good speaker. But Paul, What's Paul say? You're judging the outward appearance. We got to be careful that we don't do the same. We got to be careful that we don't judge based on how impressive someone presents the message. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that a speaker should intentionally be boring, or that a speaker should not even try to be a better speaker. Absolutely, I think you should. This is the Word of God, and it needs to be honored. But we as listeners, as the audience, need to recognize that the skill of the speaker does not determine the value of the message. Paul says, don't look at the things that are outward. Good. Mm-hmm.
But whether or not, you sometimes you get this thing where your goal seems good, but you're not fighting the battle with spiritual weapons. He's already made that point. He talks there in verse 2 or verse 3, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does.
Yes.
So there's not only a right objective, there's a right way to go about doing it. And sometimes, and you see this a lot when sort of religion and politics get merged together.
Mm-hmm.
It's good, I think, when we're going to go and we're going to participate in politics, that we take our faith with us and it informs our decision. And we think, well, not what do I think is best, but what does God think is best? But what sometimes seems to happen, and I've let this happen too, is when you get those two things married, rather than your religion influencing your politics starts influencing your religion.
Right.
Especially when they both seem to be working towards the same goal.
Mm-hmm.
If you align yourself with a political group or a political party that seems to have the same objective as we do, then you kind of want to go away with their way of achieving it, but you don't want to win the battle with the world's weapons. That's good on the surface, but deep down, you have to fight the battle the way the Lord has told you to fight the battle.
Very well said. I can't say it any better. I'll just leave it at that. And I think this kind of relates to it. The next thing that Paul says is, we have the intention, the purpose, not destroying, but building up. Even when Paul used very strong language against the Corinthians, it was always clear that his intent, his purpose was to build them up. Rhetoric never has that intention. Rhetoric, by its very nature, is destructive. Paul says we don't use those kind of tools. We don't use that kind of method. The argument was Paul is one way in person. He's someone else different when he's hiding behind a pen. Paul says, I'm the same man. I have the same goals. I have the same methods. He's already talked about the fact that if I have to be, I will be bold in person, but I don't want to be. He didn't want to be bold in his letters either. We saw that back in chapter 7, where he talked about how terrible he felt that he had caused them sorrow. Even though it was necessary, he doesn't regret it, but he regretted the sorrow. So he's the same person. And finally, those who compare themselves with themselves. That is the very basis for rhetoric. Who's the better speaker? Paul says when you start thinking about that, you're showing your own foolishness. And again, that's something we've got to be careful about. We often will find ourselves doing that, comparing this speaker against that speaker. It's not the speaker. It's the message. Is it truth? Does it match up with God's word? That it's valuable. And if it doesn't match up with God's word, I don't care how effective the speaker is. It's not helpful. It's not useful. All right. I've run out of time. We're going to talk at the very end of chapter 10 next week and then going into chapter 11. It all continues the same thought. Thank you so much for your participation.